On a morning in the year 872, on a headland jutting into the waters where three fjords met the open sea, a young man stood watching ships burn. He was perhaps 25 years old, though the sources disagree. His hair hung past his shoulders, matted and unwashed, bound by a leather cord that had not been removed in nearly a decade. The wind off the water carried smoke and the screaming of men who had chosen poorly. He did not flinch. He had stopped flinching years ago. The ships were dragon-prowed and clinker-built, their overlapping oak planks sealed with wool and tar, each one representing perhaps 2 years of labor by skilled craftsmen who were now watching their work become charcoal and memory. There were 9 of them, beached in the shallows where their crews had dragged them for repair after the battle. Now, they would never sail again. The young man had ordered them fired not because he needed to destroy them. He could have claimed them as spoils, added them to his own fleet, but because he wanted the smoke to be visible from the mountains. He wanted the jarls in their halls to see the black column rising into the gray sky and understand what it meant. It meant that Kjotve the Rich was finished. It meant that Kjotve's kingdom, which stretched from the inner reaches of the Hardangerfjord to the trading posts at Avaldsnes, no longer existed. It meant that the web of alliances and marriage ties and blood oaths that had held together the petty kingdoms of southwestern Norway for 3 generations had been severed in an afternoon. The young man's name was Harald. In the sagas that would be written 3 centuries later, he would be called Harald Fairhair, though on this particular morning his hair was anything but fair. It was filthy. It was tangled. It was the physical manifestation of an oath he had sworn a decade earlier, an oath so strange that the skalds would still be singing about it 1,000 years after his death. He had sworn not to cut or comb his hair until he had conquered all of Norway. On this morning, watching the ships burn, he was perhaps halfway there. The smoke rose, the screaming stopped, the tide began to turn, and somewhere in the mountains, in 100 timber halls scattered across a landscape of rock and ice and deep green forest, men who called themselves kings looked at the sky and began to calculate their options. What Harald, son of Halfdan, was doing had never been done before. The land that would become Norway had been divided among petty kings and jarls and chieftains for as long as memory reached. There were dozens of them, perhaps 30, perhaps more, depending on how you counted the subordinate lords and the semi-independent jarls who paid tribute to one king while raiding the lands of another. They ruled territories defined by geography, a fjord, a valley, a stretch of coastline, a cluster of islands. They made war on each other constantly, in the way that neighboring wolves make war, testing boundaries, establishing hierarchy, taking what could be taken. But no one had ever tried to take everything. No one had ever looked at the chaos of competing sovereignties and imagined it as a single kingdom waiting to be assembled. Harald looked. Harald imagined. Harald spent 30 years making the imagination real. By the time he died, an old man surrounded by sons who would immediately begin fighting each other for his throne. He had unified Norway under a single crown for the first time in history. He had driven thousands of his defeated enemies into exile, scattering them across the North Atlantic like seeds thrown from a burning field. Those exiles would found colonies in Iceland, in the Faroe Islands, in Orkney and Shetland, in Ireland and Scotland, and the islands of the Hebrides. Some of their descendants would sail west into waters no European had ever crossed and find a continent that would not be found again for 500 years. The Viking Age, as we've come to call it, was already underway when Harald began his wars of unification. Norse ships had been raiding the monasteries of Britain and Ireland for nearly a century, but the great diaspora, the massive outflow of population that would plant Scandinavian colonies from Greenland to Constantinople, accelerated dramatically during his reign. Historians still debate how much of this was cause and how much was coincidence. What is not debated is that Harald's conquests coincided with the most dramatic expansion of Norse settlement in history, and that many of the men who led that expansion were specifically fleeing his rule. He was a conqueror who accidentally became an exporter of populations. He was a unifier who created his kingdom by making it uninhabitable for anyone who opposed him. He was a founder whose founding was also an expulsion. The sagas remember him as the man who made Norway. The exiles remembered him as the man who made everywhere else. This is the story of how a young warlord with an uncut oath and an impossible ambition changed the map of the medieval world, not only by what he built, but by what he drove away. Before we enter that story fully, we must pause to consider where it comes from. The sources for Harald Fairhair's life are, to put it plainly, a problem. The earliest accounts we have were written nearly 3 centuries after his death. The Icelandic sagas, Heimskringla, composed by Snorri Sturluson around 1230, the Fagurskinna, written perhaps a decade earlier, Agrip, the oldest of the Norwegian synoptic histories, all describe Harald's conquests in detail. They name his battles, his enemies, his wives, his sons. They quote the verses of skalds who were supposedly present at the events they describe. They offer a narrative so vivid and coherent that it is tempting to treat it as straightforward history. It is not straightforward history. It is, at best, historical memory filtered through 300 years of oral transmission, political manipulation, and literary embellishment. Snorri Sturluson, our most detailed source, was not a historian in the modern sense. He was a poet, a politician, and a Christian, living in a world that had converted centuries earlier, looking back at a pagan past through lenses he could not fully remove. He had access to earlier skaldic poetry, some of which may genuinely date to Harald's time, but he also had agendas. He was writing for Norwegian kings who claimed descent from Harald. He was writing in a literary tradition that valued dramatic narrative over documentary precision. The archaeology helps, but only so much. We can confirm that the 9th century saw significant political consolidation in Western Norway. We can trace the expansion of certain burial practices and artifact styles that suggest the emergence of a more unified elite culture. We can date the founding of Icelandic settlements to the 870s and 880s, consistent with the saga accounts of refugees fleeing Harald's rule. But archaeology cannot tell us what Harald said to his enemies, what he looked like, what he thought he was doing. We are left with a choice. We can refuse to tell the story at all on the grounds that we cannot verify its details, or we can tell it as the sources tell it, acknowledging what we cannot know, flagging the moments where the sagas may be inventing rather than remembering, and trusting that beneath the literary elaboration lies some genuine memory of a man who genuinely lived and genuinely transformed his world. This is the second approach. We will tell the story. We will tell it carefully. And we will remember throughout that we are looking at Harald through a fog of centuries, seeing his outline but not always his face. To understand what Harald did, we must first understand what existed before he did it. The Norway of the mid-9th century was not a country. It was a geography, a long, narrow strip of habitable land pressed between mountains and sea, stretching from the Skagerrak in the south to the Arctic wilderness of Hålogaland in the north. The interior was largely impassable, a spine of granite and ice that divided the Scandinavian peninsula and forced all meaningful travel to happen by water. To live in Norway was to live on the edge of things, in the thin margin between rock and wave, where farms could be carved out of hillsides and ships could be launched from stony beaches. The land itself dictated the shape of political power. Each fjord was its own world, connected to the sea but separated from its neighbors by cliffs and glaciers that made overland travel between them difficult or impossible for much of the year. A king in the Sonefjord could not easily project power into the Hardangerfjord, even though they might be only 50 miles apart as the raven flies. The mountains made every valley a natural fortress. The sea made every coastline a potential highway for raiders and traders and refugees. In this geography, centralized authority was almost impossible to maintain. Power fragmented along the lines the land itself drew. By Harald's time, there were perhaps 30 distinct political units that might reasonably be called kingdoms, though the word requires careful handling. A 9th century Norwegian king, a konungur, was not a monarch in the later medieval sense. He was a war leader, a cult officiator, a dispenser of justice, a redistributor of wealth. His authority rested on his ability to attract and retain the loyalty of free men who could, in principle, transfer their allegiance to a rival if he failed them. The system was not feudal. There were no lords and vassals in the continental sense, no grants of land in exchange for military service, no elaborate hierarchy of obligation. What existed was something older and simpler, a network of personal relationships constantly renegotiated, in which a king maintained his position by being more generous, more successful in war, and more politically adept than his competitors. A king who lost battles would lose followers. A king who hoarded treasure instead of distributing it would find his hall empty at the next feast. A king who offended the gods would bring bad harvests and lose the loyalty of men who needed the gods' favor to survive. The jarls who served these kings were not quite nobles and not quite vassals. They were regional strongmen, often commanding as much loyalty in their own territories as the kings they nominally served. A powerful jarl might switch his allegiance from one king to another, bringing his warriors and his ships with him, tipping the balance of power in a region with a single decision. The system was fluid, violent, and unstable. Kings rose and fell within a generation. Dynasties rarely lasted more than 3 or 4 rulers before being displaced by a rival lineage. This was the world into which Harald was born, probably around 850, probably in the kingdom of Vestfold, on the western shore of the Oslo fjord. Vestfold was, by the standards of 9th century Norway, a significant power. It controlled the trading routes through the Skagerrak, the vital connection between the Baltic and the North Sea. Its kings had been accumulating wealth and influence for generations. Archaeological excavations at sites like Bora and Gokstad have revealed ship burials of astonishing richness. The famous Gokstad ship, with its elegant lines and sophisticated construction, was buried around 900, during or just after Harald's reign, and suggests a kingdom of considerable resources and ambition. Harald's father was Halfdan the Black, a king who had already begun the process of consolidation that Harald would complete. Halfdan had expanded Vestfold's territory through a combination of conquest and strategic marriage, absorbing several neighboring kingdoms and establishing himself as the dominant power in southeastern Norway. He was, by the accounts that survive, a successful war leader and a generous ring-giver, the 2 qualities that mattered most for a 9th century king. He was also, in his late life, unlucky. The sagas say he drowned when his sledge broke through the ice of a frozen lake, returning from a feast in early spring. The ice, weakened by the waste from a cattle barn that had been placed near the lake's edge, gave way beneath him. He was perhaps 50 years old. Harald was perhaps 10. What followed was a decade of regency and uncertainty. The sources are thin here, but the outlines are clear enough. Halfdan's kingdom did not immediately collapse. His widow and his jarls held it together through the dangerous years of Harald's minority, but neither did it expand. The momentum of conquest stalled. The coalitions Halfdan had built began to fray. By the time Harald reached manhood, the position he inherited was strong, but not unassailable. He was king of Vestfold and its dependent territories, but he was one king among many, and there were rivals who saw his youth as opportunity. The sagas say that everything changed because of a woman. Her name, in most versions, was Gyda. She was the daughter of a king in Hordaland, one of the western kingdoms that Vestfold did not yet control. Harald, probably in his late teens, sent men to ask for her hand in marriage. She refused, but her refusal, according to the sources, was not a rejection. It was a challenge. She would not marry a king who ruled only a few districts, she said. She would marry a king who ruled all of Norway, as Gorm ruled Denmark and Erik ruled Sweden. Let Harald conquer the whole country, and then she would consider his proposal. The story may be legendary. It has the shape of folklore, the impossible task set by the beautiful princess, the young hero who accepts the challenge, the oath that binds him to a decade of striving. Similar stories appear in saga literature across the Norse world. But something prompted Harald to attempt what no one before him had attempted, and the saga's explanation that he was driven by romantic ambition, by the need to prove himself worthy of a woman who demanded a kingdom as bride price, is at least psychologically plausible. Young men have done stranger things for stranger reasons. What is certain is that Harald made an oath. He would not cut or comb his hair until he had subdued all of Norway under his rule. The oath was public, witnessed, binding in ways that modern people may find difficult to understand. In a culture where a man's word was the foundation of his social existence, where oath-breaking was among the most serious crimes and oath-keeping among the highest virtues, the vow Harald made was not a dramatic gesture. It was a commitment with real consequences. He could not retreat from it without destroying his reputation. He could not fail without being humiliated. He had bound his own fate to an outcome that everyone who heard the oath probably considered impossible. And then, for roughly 10 years, his hair grew. The wars of unification did not happen all at once. They unfolded in stages across a landscape that resisted conquest at every turn, against enemies who fought with the desperation of men defending their birthright and their way of life. Harald began in the south and east, in the territories closest to Vestfold, where his father's alliances still held and where geography made military campaigns logistically feasible. He fought in Romerike and Hedmark, in the upland districts where the mountains began to rise. Some of these campaigns were conquests in the traditional sense. Armies met, battles were fought, one side prevailed. Others were diplomatic absorptions, smaller kings accepting Harald's overlordship in exchange for retaining their local authority. The line between conquest and alliance was often blurred. A king who submitted might keep his title and his lands, paying tribute and providing warriors when called upon. His sovereignty diminished but not extinguished. The eastern campaigns established Harald's base of operations and trained the army that would eventually carry him to the western coast. The men who fought in Romerike and Hedmark learned how to campaign together, how to supply themselves across difficult terrain, how to coordinate the movements of multiple detachments operating in parallel. They also learned, presumably, something about their young king, his willingness to take risks, his treatment of those who surrendered, his responses to betrayal. By the mid-860s, the chronology is uncertain, but the rough sequence is clear. Harald had consolidated the eastern territories and begun to turn his attention west. This was where the real challenge lay. The western fjords were the heartland of Norwegian maritime power, the home of the most formidable sea kings and the most independent-minded jarls. They were also the most defensible. Every fjord was a trap waiting to close on an invading fleet. Every headland was a potential ambush site. An army that could march overland in the east would have to take to ships in the west, fighting enemies who had been sailing these waters for generations. Harald built a fleet. The sources don't tell us much about the specifics, but the archaeology suggests what would have been required: dozens of longships, each carrying 30 to 60 warriors, each representing an enormous investment of timber and iron and skilled labor. The ships of this period were technological marvels, light enough to be portaged overland, seaworthy enough to cross the open ocean, fast enough to overtake merchant vessels and outrun pursuit. Building a fleet capable of challenging the Western kings would have required years of preparation and resources that only a successful conqueror could command. The first major Western campaign was probably against the Trøndelag, the region around the Trondheimsfjord that would later become the political center of medieval Norway. The Trøndelag was controlled by the Jarls of Lade, one of the most powerful families in the country, and by a network of petty kings who had long resisted domination from the south. Harald's approach here seems to have been a combination of force and negotiation. He fought when he had to, but he also made alliances with Jarls who could see which way the wind was blowing. The Jarls of Lade, in particular, became among his most important supporters, a family that would remain politically significant in Norway for centuries. The conquest of the Trøndelag gave Harald control of the overland route into the western fjords. It also gave him access to the agricultural surplus and the warrior population of one of Norway's most productive regions. He could now support larger armies for longer campaigns. The logic of conquest was accumulating. Each victory provided the resources for the next, but the western fjords themselves remained unconquered, and it was there, in the convoluted waterways of Hordaland and Rogaland, that Harald would fight the battles that the Skalds would remember. The kings of the western fjords had watched Harald's rise with a mixture of contempt and calculation. Some of them, probably, dismissed him as another ambitious Easterner who would overreach and fall like so many before him. Others took him more seriously, beginning to assemble the alliances that might stop him. The fjord kingdoms had long traditions of mutual rivalry, but they also had traditions of coalition against outside threats. An invasion from Vestfold qualified as an outside threat. The leading figure in the emerging resistance was Kjotve the Rich, who ruled a territory centered on the Karmøy Island and the trading post at Avaldsnes. Kjotve was wealthy, the epithet was earned, not ironic, and his wealth came from the same sources that made all the Western kings powerful. Control of maritime trade routes, the ability to levy tolls on ships passing through his waters, and access to the resources of the sea. He was probably older than Harald, established where Harald was still striving, comfortable in a power he had inherited rather than seized. Around Kjotve gathered a coalition of lesser kings, Sulka of Rogaland, who brought ships and warriors from the coast south of Kjotve's territory, Soti, whose domain lay somewhere in the tangle of islands off the western shore, others whose names the sagas preserve without always making clear what lands they ruled. Together, they represented the greatest concentration of military force Harald had yet faced. If they could coordinate their fleets, if they could catch Harald's ships in unfavorable waters, they might end his conquest in a single battle. The battle came, probably in 872, though the date remains debated. The location was Hafrsfjord, a narrow inlet on the southwestern coast near modern Stavanger. The sagas describe it as the decisive confrontation of Harald's career, the moment when the scattered resistance of the western kings was broken, and Harald's supremacy established beyond challenge. What we can reconstruct of the battle suggests a brutal, close-quarters naval engagement. The ships would have grappled together, forming floating platforms where men fought with swords and axes and spears, the decks slippery with blood and seawater. Harald's fleet was probably larger. He had the accumulated resources of his eastern and northern conquests, but Kjotve and his allies had the advantage of defending their home waters, fighting near their own bases with their families watching from the shores. It was not enough. The coalition broke. Kjotve fled. The sagas say he escaped and spent the rest of his life as an exile, though they do not agree on where he went. Sulka died, either in the battle itself or in its immediate aftermath. Soti fell. The kings who had wagered their kingdoms on stopping Harald lost their wagers, and their kingdoms became Harald's. The burning ships on the headland where we began, if the scene is historical at all and not merely the dramatic reconstruction of later storytellers, would have come in the days after Hafrsfjord, as Harald consolidated his victory and demonstrated to the watching hills that resistance was no longer a viable option. After Hafrsfjord, the character of Harald's wars changed. He was no longer an ambitious young king fighting for territory. He was the dominant power in Norway, and his campaigns became less about conquest than about enforcement. The petty kings who remained, in the north, in the interior, in the islands offshore, faced a choice: submit or flee. Many submitted. The saga accounts suggest that Harald established a system of tribute and subordination, allowing local kings to retain their titles and some degree of local autonomy in exchange for acknowledging his overlordship, paying taxes, and providing warriors when called upon. This was not centralized administration in the medieval European sense. Harald had no bureaucracy, no written law code, no apparatus of royal government beyond his personal household, but it was a significant consolidation of power nonetheless. For the first time, there was something that could meaningfully be called a Norwegian kingdom, even if its coherence depended entirely on the presence and personality of its king. But many did not submit. And this is where the story of Harald Fairhair becomes also the story of the North Atlantic world. The men who refused to accept Harald's rule had limited options. They could fight, and likely die. They could submit and accept a diminished status that many found intolerable. Or they could leave, take their ships, their families, their followers, and sail away to places where Harald's arm did not reach. They chose to leave. In numbers that the archaeology confirms were significant, the defeated and the defiant, and the simply unwilling, packed their households onto ships and sailed west. Some went to the Orkney and Shetland Islands, where Norse settlers had been establishing themselves for decades. Some went to the Hebrides, to Ireland, to the coastlines of Scotland and northern England, where Viking raiders had been operating for nearly a century. Some went to the Faroe Islands, remote and windswept, where sheep could be raised and Harald could be forgotten. And some went further. Some went to a place that had been discovered only recently, an island so large and so empty that it could absorb all the refugees Harald's conquests could produce. They went to Iceland. The settlement of Iceland began, according to the Icelandic sources, in the 870s, precisely the decade of Harald's final wars of unification. The Book of Settlements, compiled in medieval Iceland, lists the names and genealogies of the original settlers, and a striking number of them are described as refugees from Harald's rule. They were jarls and chieftains, farmers and warriors, men who had held power in Norway and refused to hold it as Harald's subordinates. They brought their families, their slaves, their livestock, their gods. They carved farms out of volcanic soil and established a society that would, within a century, produce one of the great literary cultures of medieval Europe. The connection between Harald's unification of Norway and the settlement of Iceland is too consistent across too many sources to be merely legendary. Something drove a population movement of unusual scale and speed. Harald's conquests are the most plausible cause. He did not intend this. He could not have foreseen that his wars would populate an empty island 1,000 miles to the west. He was trying to build a kingdom, not seed a diaspora. But history is made by consequences as much as intentions, and the consequences of Harald's ambition reached far beyond the fjords he conquered. The sources say that Harald finally cut his hair after Hafrsfjord, or perhaps a few years later, when the last resistance in the western fjords had been subdued. The oath had been fulfilled, or fulfilled enough. A man named Ragnvald, Jarl of Mura, and one of Harald's most loyal supporters, performed the cutting and gave Harald the epithet by which history would remember him. The hair, released from its decade of neglect, was apparently beautiful. Fairhair, Harfagri. The story has the quality of ritual, of transformation. The wild-haired warrior becomes the golden-maned king. The oath-bound striver becomes the established ruler. The chapter closes and a new one opens. But Harald's life after Hafrsfjord was not simply a peaceful reign over a unified kingdom. The very forces that had allowed him to conquer Norway, the independence of the jarls, the instability of personal lordship, the absence of institutions that could outlast any individual ruler, would ensure that his kingdom remained fragile, contested, and ultimately impermanent. He married prolifically. The sagas credit him with somewhere between 9 and 20 wives or concubines. The numbers vary between sources, and the distinction between wife and concubine was itself fluid. These marriages were political instruments, alliances sealed with the bodies of women from powerful families. Each marriage produced children. The children grew up to be rivals. By the time Harald reached old age, he had perhaps 20 sons who might plausibly claim a share of his kingdom. The mathematics were ominous. A kingdom built by the will of one exceptional ruler, divided among 20 ambitious heirs, would not remain unified for long. Harald seems to have recognized this. The sagas describe various attempts to manage the succession, to designate a primary heir, to arrange the relationships among his sons in ways that might prevent civil war. It did not work. Harald's death, probably around 933, though the date is uncertain, was followed almost immediately by conflict among his sons. The kingdom he had spent his life building began to fracture within years of his passing. His grandson, Håkon the Good, would spend his reign fighting to hold together what Harald had assembled. His great-grandson, Harald Greycloak, would die in battle against his own kinsmen. The unified Norway that Harald Fairhair had created would not truly stabilize until nearly a century after his death, and even then it would remain contested, fragmentary, never quite as solid as the later saga tradition wanted to remember. But that is a story for later telling. For now, we remain in the years of conquest, in the decade when a young man with uncut hair and an impossible oath fought his way from Vestfold to Hafrsfjord and changed the shape of the north. The smoke has risen from the burning ships, the mountains have seen it. The survivors are calculating their options, to submit, to fight, or to flee. And across the gray waters of the North Atlantic, islands are waiting to receive whoever chooses to sail. The wind does not care who rules Norway. The current does not care whether the ships it carries bear conquerors or refugees, but the people in those ships, the warriors, the farmers, the women and children, the slaves with no choice in the matter, they care. Their choices, made in the shadow of Harald's ambition, will plant settlements from the Faroe Islands to Newfoundland. Their descendants will tell stories about this moment for 1,000 years. Harald Fairhair stands on the headland, watching the ships burn. He is perhaps 25 years old. His hair is still matted and filthy, though not for much longer. He has done what no one before him has done. He has unified a country that did not know it was a country. He cannot see the consequences. He cannot see Iceland filling with his enemies' children. He cannot see the blood feuds among his own sons. He cannot see the fragmentation that will follow his death, or the long centuries of struggle it will take to reassemble what he built. He sees only the smoke. He sees only the victory. It is, for this moment, enough. The oath had been fulfilled. Now came the haircut. The sagas describe the scene with the specificity of a ceremony long remembered. Harald, having conquered his way across Norway, having broken the fleet at Hafrsfjord, having proven that the impossible vow of a lovesick teenager could bend the world to its shape, Harald finally allowed the knots to be cut from his hair. The man who performed the cutting was Ragnvald, Jarl of Mura, one of Harald's most powerful allies, a lord who had staked his own fate on the young king's ambition and been rewarded with territory and honor. The name Ragnvald gave him that day was not Fairhair. It was Lufa, the matted one, the tangled one, a name that remembered what Harald had been for a decade, a man who had let his body become the visible symbol of an uncompleted promise. But after the cutting, another name emerged. The sources differ on exactly when it attached itself, but within a generation, the name that survived was Harfagri, Fairhair. The hair that had been a mess of filth and neglect was revealed, once washed, once combed, once freed from its decade of binding, to be beautiful. Thick and golden, falling to his shoulders like something from a poem. The transformation was itself a kind of story. The wild man becomes the king. The oath keeper becomes the ruler. The matted beast reveals the golden sovereign beneath. We cannot know if this actually happened. We cannot know if Harald's hair was truly golden, or if the washing was as ceremonial as the sagas suggest, or if Ragnvald truly stood there with shears in his hand while the smoke from Hafrsfjord still hung in the air. What we can know is that the story mattered. It mattered enough to be told. It mattered enough to attach itself to every subsequent retelling of Harald's life. The haircut became the hinge point, the moment when the conquest ended and the reign began. And with the reign came the harder work. Conquering Norway had required a particular set of skills: military genius, personal charisma, the ability to inspire loyalty in men who might otherwise have killed each other for cattle and silver. Ruling Norway would require something different. It would require institutions. It would require systems that could outlast Harald's own body. It would require answers to questions that no one in Scandinavia had ever needed to answer before. How do you tax a population that has never been taxed by a central authority? How do you administer justice across territories separated by mountains and fjords, territories that had always governed themselves through local assemblies and blood feuds? How do you prevent the Jarls who helped you conquer from deciding, a few years later, that they could rule just as well without you? How do you keep your own sons from killing each other once you are dead? Harald's answers to these questions would shape Norway for centuries. They would also demonstrate the limits of what any single ruler could accomplish in a society without bureaucracy, without writing, without the infrastructure that made governance possible in the older kingdoms to the south. The tax was called landskuld. It was not, strictly speaking, new. Local chieftains had always extracted tribute from the farmers under their protection. What was new was the claim that this tribute ultimately belonged to the king, that it flowed upward through the jarls to Harald himself, that the land itself was now held at the king's pleasure rather than owned outright by the families who worked it. The sagas present this as Harald's great innovation and his great crime. He took the odel, the hereditary right to ancestral land, and he made it conditional on royal favor. A family that had farmed the same valley for 5 generations might now find that their land belonged to Harald, that they held it as tenants rather than owners, that their ancient rights had been dissolved by the sword. This is almost certainly an exaggeration. The practical machinery for such a comprehensive seizure of land rights did not exist. Harald could not have surveyed every farm in Norway, could not have registered every title, could not have enforced a universal transformation of property law across territories he could barely communicate with. What he could do, and what he probably did do, was assert the principle. The king's authority extended over all land. Whether that authority could be enforced in any particular valley was a separate question. But the assertion mattered. It changed the terms of negotiation between ruler and ruled. It gave future kings a legal claim to expand their power whenever circumstances allowed, and it gave the farmers and minor nobles who resented Harald's rule a grievance that could be articulated in terms of justice rather than mere ambition. They were not simply losers in a power struggle. They were victims of tyranny. Their ancient freedoms had been stolen. The distinction between conquest and tyranny would prove crucial for what came next. Harald governed through jarls. The word itself is old, cognate with the English earl, and it designated a tier of nobility below the king but above the ordinary landholders. Harald had not invented the jarls. They had existed before him, ruling their own territories with varying degrees of independence, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes allied against common enemies. What Harald did was systematize them. He appointed jarls to territories. He held them accountable for the taxes and military levies those territories produced. He created, in effect, a layer of administration between himself and the thousands of farms that now theoretically owed him allegiance. The system worked after a fashion. It concentrated military force under Harald's command. It created a class of nobles whose power depended on royal favor, who had reason to support the king against any local rebellion. It allowed Harald to project authority across distances that would otherwise have been ungovernable. It also planted the seeds of every future conflict. The jarls were powerful men. They commanded warriors, they collected taxes, they administered justice, and they were, in the end, potential rivals. A jarl who controlled a wealthy territory, who had built loyalty among his own men, who had married well and produced capable sons, such a jarl might begin to wonder why he needed a king at all. The system that allowed Harald to rule Norway also created a permanent aristocracy with the means and the motive to challenge royal power. Harald managed this through the only tools available to him: marriage, intimidation, and the careful distribution of favor. He married his daughters to the jarls he most needed to bind. He moved quickly against any sign of independent ambition. He rewarded loyalty lavishly and punished disloyalty with exemplary violence. For the decades of his active rule, it worked. The jarls stayed loyal. The kingdom held together. But it worked because Harald was Harald. It worked because the man himself was present, watching, judging, ready to act. There was no institution that could perform this function in his absence. There was no law that could compel loyalty once the king's sword arm weakened. The whole system depended on the continued existence and continued vitality of one exceptional individual. When that individual aged, when he eventually died, the system would face its fundamental test. It would fail that test. But not yet. For now, in the years immediately after Hafrsfjord, Harald Fairhair ruled a kingdom that had never existed before. He held court. He received tribute. He dispensed justice, or what passed for justice, in a society where the distinction between law and royal will had not yet been clearly drawn. He fathered children, many children by many women, each child a potential ally and a potential rival, each mother's family a faction in the endless calculus of succession. And around him, the people he had conquered were making their own calculations. Some submitted. The jarls who had bent the knee at Hafrsfjord, or who had joined Harald before the battle, found themselves confirmed in their positions or elevated to new ones. They had wagered correctly. They would spend the rest of their lives as the king's men, bound to Harald by oaths they dared not break, enjoying the privileges of royal favor, hoping their sons would inherit both their lands and their positions. Some resisted. Scattered across Norway, in the valleys the king's men had not yet reached, in the islands where central authority had never penetrated, there were holdouts. Minor chieftains who refused to acknowledge Harald's supremacy, families nursing grudges from the wars of unification, men who had lost fathers and brothers at Hafrsfjord and who dreamed of vengeance. Harald dealt with these as he dealt with all threats, violently, efficiently, without sentiment. The sagas record punitive expeditions, burnings, executions, the systematic destruction of anyone who might serve as a rallying point for resistance. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the cold logic of a ruler who understood that his kingdom existed only so long as no one could successfully challenge it. Every rebel allowed to live was a rebellion waiting to happen. Every chieftain left in possession of his warriors was an army that might one day march against the king. The people who witnessed this, the farmers watching their neighbors' halls burn, the women burying their husbands, the children growing up in the shadow of Harald's victories, they drew their own conclusions. Some concluded that resistance was futile, that submission was the only rational choice, that the old world of independent petty kingdoms was gone and would not return. These people became Norwegians. They adapted to the new order. They paid their taxes. They answered the king's summons. They told themselves that Harald's peace was better than the endless small wars of the old days. Others concluded something different. They concluded that Norway under Harald was no longer a place where free men could live, that the landskald was theft and the king's justice was tyranny, that their fathers had lived and died as lords of their own land, and that they would not live as tenants on farms their ancestors had cleared. These people got on boats. The settlement of Iceland did not begin with Harald Fairhair. Scandinavian sailors had been aware of the island for decades, possibly longer. Irish monks had reached it in their leather boats seeking solitude, finding an empty land of fire and ice at the edge of the habitable world. Norse ships had made landfall, explored the coasts, returned with reports of good grazing land and abundant fish. The island was known. It was not yet settled. What changed in the years after Hafrsfjord was the motive. Before Harald, Iceland was a curiosity, a distant place that might be worth visiting, but not worth the enormous risk of actually trying to live there. After Harald, Iceland became something else. It became a refuge. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, compiled in the 12th century from earlier oral traditions, records the names of the settlers who came to Iceland in the decades following Harald's unification of Norway. The names come with stories, and the stories, again and again, follow the same pattern. A man who was powerful in Norway, who held land, who commanded warriors, who refused to submit to Harald's authority, or who fell afoul of the king's justice. A man who faced a choice between submission and exile, between bending the knee and losing everything that made life worth living. These men chose exile. They gathered their families, their slaves, their livestock, their portable wealth. They loaded their ships with the goods that would let them survive in an empty land. Tools, seeds, the knowledge carried in their heads of how to farm, how to fish, how to build. And they sailed west into the unknown. The crossing was brutal. The North Atlantic between Norway and Iceland is not forgiving water. The distance is roughly 700 miles, depending on the route, and the route itself was not fixed. Ships navigated by the sun, by the stars, by the patterns of waves and the flights of birds. They carried no compasses. They had no charts worthy of the name. They sailed with the accumulated wisdom of generations, knowledge passed from father to son about how the swells behaved when land was near, how the color of the water changed over shallow banks, how certain seabirds never flew far from shore. Many did not make it. We have no way of counting the ships that sank, the families that drowned, the settlements that never happened because the settlers died in transit. The successful crossings are recorded. The failures are silence. But we can infer from the dangers of the route that for every family that reached Iceland, there may have been others who set out and never arrived. The sea kept what it took. The sagas remember only the survivors. Those survivors found a land unlike anything they had known. Iceland is volcanic. It is geologically young, still being formed by the forces that built it, still shuddering with earthquakes and erupting with the molten rock that gives the island its Icelandic name. Island, the land of ice, though it might more accurately have been called the land of fire. Glaciers covered the highlands. Hot springs bubbled from the ground. Geysers erupted in columns of steam that could be seen for miles. The settlers came from the green valleys of Norway, from farmland their ancestors had cleared from ancient forests, and they arrived in a place where trees were scarce, where the wind never stopped, where winter darkness lasted for months. But there was land. Good land by the standards of people who knew how to work with what the north offered. The coastal lowlands could support livestock. The rivers ran with salmon. The seas teemed with fish and seal and whale. A man who knew what he was doing, who had brought the right tools and the right knowledge, could build a life here. It would be hard, it would be isolated, it would require every skill the settlers possessed and the invention of new skills besides. It would be free. That was the point. That was what Harald's exiles were seeking, whether they articulated it in those terms or not. In Iceland, there was no king. There was no jarl collecting tribute for a distant sovereign. There was no landskald, no taxation, no law but what the settlers made for themselves. A man who took land in Iceland held it as his own, absolutely, the way his grandfather had held land in Norway before Harald's armies came. The property was his. The justice was his to dispense. He owed nothing to any authority beyond his own community. The irony would take decades to become fully visible, but it was present from the beginning. Harald Fairhair, in unifying Norway, had accidentally created the conditions for one of the most remarkable political experiments in medieval Europe. The people who fled his tyranny would build in Iceland a society without a king, a commonwealth governed by assemblies, by law rather than by monarchy, by the collective decisions of free farmers who had learned from bitter experience what happened when one man claimed dominion over all the rest. They called their gathering the Althing. It met each summer at a place called Thingvellir, a rift valley where the tectonic plates of Europe and North America pull slowly apart. The symbolism was not intentional, but it was fitting. The settlers had come from the old world to build something new. They had crossed an ocean to escape a king. They gathered each year in a place where the earth itself was splitting, where new land was being born from the gaps between the old, and they made laws for themselves. The Althing was not a democracy in any modern sense. Power still concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Chieftains called Godar controlled the political machinery. Women could not vote. Slaves had no standing at all. But within its limitations, the Icelandic system represented something genuinely novel, a society of significant complexity, eventually numbering tens of thousands of people, that governed itself without a monarch for over 3 centuries. This was Harald Fairhair's unintended legacy. The man who unified Norway scattered the seeds of a very different political tradition across the North Atlantic. The people who fled him carried with them not just their livestock and their tools, but also their memories of what they had lost, and their determination to build something that could not be taken from them the same way. Iceland received them. But Iceland was not the only destination. The Faroe Islands, scattered across the North Atlantic between Norway and Iceland, had been settled earlier, perhaps by Irish monks, certainly by Scandinavians by the early 9th century. Harald's consolidation of power accelerated migration there as well. The islands were small, rocky, perpetually windswept, capable of supporting only a limited population. But they were outside Harald's reach. For families seeking distance from royal authority without committing to the full terror of the Icelandic crossing, the Faroes offered a middle path. The Orkney and Shetland Islands, lying off the northern tip of Britain, presented different possibilities. These were closer to existing Scandinavian trade routes. They had been raided by Vikings for decades. They offered access to the rich pickings of Britain and Ireland, monasteries with accumulated treasures, kingdoms weakened by internal conflict, land that could be taken from people who lacked the military power to defend it. Harald's reach extended even here, eventually. The saga's record that he launched an expedition to the Western Islands, motivated at least in part by the problem of Vikings using Orkney and Shetland as bases from which to raid Norway itself. Men who had fled Harald's tyranny were circling back to harass his coasts, staging raids on Norwegian ships and settlements before retreating to islands beyond the king's practical authority. Harald could not tolerate this. A king who could not protect his own coastline from pirates, even if those pirates were his own former subjects, was not truly a king at all. Sometime around 875, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, Harald brought his fleet west. The details of this expedition are murky. The sources contradict each other on timing, on the specific islands involved, on the outcomes. What seems clear is that Harald imposed some form of authority over Orkney and Shetland, installing a jarl, Ragnvald of Møre, the same man who had cut his hair after Hafrsfjord, or perhaps Ragnvald's kinsmen as rulers of the islands under Norwegian sovereignty. The Western Viking bases would henceforth be part of Harald's domain, at least in theory. The raiders would become subjects, or they would move on to places where Harald's ships could not follow. This was the pattern of Harald's reign. A continuous process of consolidation, of bringing under central control territories and people who had previously operated independently. Every success bred new challenges. Every submission created new resentments. The kingdom grew, and as it grew, it became harder to govern, harder to hold together, more dependent on the continued presence and continued vitality of the king himself. The jarls who ruled under Harald's authority understood this. They were intelligent men, many of them, capable of the same strategic calculations their king employed. They saw that Harald's power rested on his personal reputation, on the fear his victories had instilled, on the loyalty of men who had fought beside him in the wars of unification. They saw that no system existed to transfer this power to a successor. They saw that Harald was aging, that his many sons were watching each other with the calculation of rivals, that the moment of Harald's death would be the moment of maximum danger. Some of them began to position themselves for what would come after, and in the valleys and along the coasts, among the farmers who paid the landskald and the minor landholders who had lost their independence, other calculations were being made. Some had accepted the new order, some were biding their time, some were teaching their sons to remember what had been taken from them, to keep alive the grievances that might one day fuel rebellion. Harald ruled. The kingdom held. The ships that could not bear his authority continued to sail westward, carrying the seeds of societies that would outlast anything Harald built. And the future, as always, remained hidden from everyone who was living through the present. The king's hair had been cut and washed and revealed as golden. The oath had been fulfilled. Norway had been unified, and none of it would last. Not the unity, not the peace, not the careful arrangements Harald made to preserve his work beyond his death. But he could not know that. Standing at the height of his power, receiving tribute from jarls who had once been his enemies, watching his sons grow into the men who would eventually tear his kingdom apart, Harald Fairhair saw only what any ruler sees, the present moment, solid and real, and a future that seemed to be his to shape. The wind off the fjord carried the sounds of a working kingdom, ships being loaded, cattle being driven, hammers ringing on iron. Somewhere, a ship was being prepared for the crossing to Iceland. Somewhere, a farmer was teaching his son to hate the name of Harald. The king did not hear it. Kings rarely do. The sons of Harald Fairhair were numerous. The exact number depends on which source you trust, and none of the sources should be trusted entirely. Snorri Sturluson, writing 3 centuries after the events he describes, names 20 sons by various wives and concubines. Other accounts give different numbers. What matters is not the precise figure, but the structural reality it represents. Harald had produced an abundance of potential heirs, and he had done so deliberately. This was not carelessness, this was policy. In the Norse tradition, kingship was not automatically inherited by the eldest son. It was claimed by the strongest, the most capable, the one who could command the loyalty of enough armed men to enforce his claim. By fathering many sons on many women, daughters of jarls, daughters of kings, women of varying status and varying political utility, Harald was doing what any prudent king of his era would do. He was creating options. He was building alliances through marriage. He was ensuring that even if some sons died young, as sons often did, others would survive to carry forward his line. But he was also creating a problem that no amount of foresight could solve. Each son represented a potential claim to the kingdom. Each son had a mother whose family had expectations. Each son grew up watching his brothers, calculating his chances, wondering which of them would eventually have to be killed, exiled, or subordinated when their father died. The sources give us names, but names attached to thin biographies. Eirik, called Bloodaxe, would become the most famous or the most infamous. He was the son of Ragnhild, a Danish princess, and Harald apparently favored him above the others, perhaps because of his mother's lineage. Perhaps because of qualities the sources hint at, but do not describe in detail. Håkon, another son, would be fostered at the court of King Athelstan in England, a diplomatic arrangement that would have profound consequences. Björn, Olaf, Sigurd, Ragnvald. The names multiply across the pages, each representing a man who lived and breathed and schemed and hoped, each now reduced to a few scattered references in texts compiled generations after their deaths. We cannot reconstruct their childhoods. We cannot know what it felt like to grow up as one of Harald Fairhair's sons, to understand from an early age that your brothers were also your rivals, that the kingdom your father had built was not large enough to be divided among all of you, that some of you would have to lose everything so that one or two could inherit. But we can infer the atmosphere. We can imagine the court of an aging conqueror surrounded by young men who had inherited his ambition, but had not yet had the opportunity to prove themselves in the way he had proved himself. We can imagine the whispered alliances, the careful cultivation of retainers, the watchful calculation that must have characterized relationships between half-brothers who knew that their fates were bound together in opposition. Harald, for his part, seems to have attempted a solution. The sources describe a system, whether it was Harald's invention or merely Harald's formalization of existing practice is unclear, in which the kingdom was divided among his sons while he still lived. Each son received a territory to rule, a portion of the kingdom's revenues, a domain over which he could exercise authority. The idea, presumably, was to give each son a stake in the existing order, a reason to cooperate rather than compete, a structure that might hold together after Harald's death. It did not work. It could not work. The logic of the system guaranteed its failure. Give 20 ambitious men pieces of a kingdom, and each will want a larger piece. Give brothers authority over adjacent territories, and they will quarrel about boundaries, about trade routes, about precedence and honor. Give young warriors with their father's blood in their veins a taste of power, and they will want more. The internal conflicts of Harald's later reign are poorly documented but clearly attested. Sons fought sons, alliances formed and dissolved. Harald, growing old, found himself arbitrating disputes among the very men he had created, trying to hold together a system that his own choices had made unstable. The kingdom that had been won by the sword would have to be held together by the sword, perpetually, against threats from without and from within. And the threats from within were in some ways more dangerous than the threats from without. An external enemy unites. A brother's betrayal divides. The jarls who served under Harald understood this dynamic. Some of them positioned themselves as supporters of one son or another, calculating which horse to back, which alliance might prove most advantageous when the old king finally died. Others tried to maintain neutrality, to preserve their positions regardless of which son eventually prevailed. Still others, perhaps, began to wonder whether the opportunity created by succession conflict might be used to recover some of the independence they had lost. This was the structural fragility at the heart of Harald's achievement. He had unified Norway by personal force, by the accumulation of victories and the establishment of fear. But personal force cannot be inherited. The fear Harald had instilled would die with him. His sons would have to establish their own reputations, win their own battles, create their own legends, and they would have to do so while fighting each other. The sagas tell us that Harald eventually designated Eirik as his primary heir, the son who would inherit the high kingship, while the others retained their subordinate territories. If this is true, and there is reason for skepticism, since the sagas were written partly to legitimize Eirik's descendants, it would represent an attempt to impose order on the succession, to make clear which son held precedence. But even if Harald made such a designation, the history of medieval succession is littered with designated heirs who never inherited, with younger brothers who proved more ruthless or more popular or simply luckier than the chosen ones. Eirik Bloodaxe would eventually rule Norway, briefly. He would also rule Northumbria, in England, also briefly. He would die violently, as Viking rulers often did. But that is a story for another telling. What matters here is the situation Harald had created. A kingdom unified in theory, divided in practice among rival claimants, held together only by the aging king's diminishing authority, waiting for the moment of fracture that everyone knew was coming. Meanwhile, the emigrations continued. The flow of settlers to Iceland, to the Faroes, to the scattered islands of the North Atlantic did not stop because Harald had established his authority. If anything, it intensified. The sources for this period are problematic. The Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, was compiled centuries later and contains much that is legendary or exaggerated, but the basic pattern seems clear. Families continued to leave Norway. Some were fleeing Harald's authority directly, either because they had opposed him in battle or because they could not accept the new order of taxation and subordination. Others were fleeing the instability that Harald's reign had created, the endless petty conflicts among his sons and supporters, the atmosphere of suspicion and calculation that characterized a kingdom in transition. And some, we must acknowledge, were simply seeking opportunity. Iceland offered land. Land in Norway was increasingly controlled by the king and his allies. A free farmer who could not expand his holdings in the western fjords might find in Iceland the space to build something of his own. Not everyone who sailed west was a political refugee. Some were simply ambitious. But the distinction matters less than it might seem. Whether they left because of Harald or despite him, the emigrants carried with them the skills and traditions of Norse society. They knew how to build ships, how to work iron, how to survive in harsh climates. They knew the laws and customs of their homeland, and they would adapt these to their new circumstances. They knew the gods and the stories, and they would preserve these through the long centuries until Christian scribes wrote them down. The dispersal that Harald's conquests accelerated was also a dispersal of culture, a spreading of seeds that would flower in unexpected places. Iceland would develop its own distinctive society, a commonwealth without a king, governed by an assembly of free farmers, conducting its affairs through law rather than royal decree. The Icelanders would remember Harald, but they would remember him as the tyrant their ancestors had fled. They would build something deliberately different from what he had built, and they would preserve, in their sagas and their Eddas, a version of the Norse world that might otherwise have been lost. In the Orkneys and Shetlands, the situation was different. Harald had imposed his authority there, however tenuously. The jarls who ruled the islands did so in theory as his vassals, bound to him by oaths of loyalty and the memory of his military power. But the islands were far from Norway, separated by dangerous waters, difficult to reach and difficult to control. The jarls had considerable practical autonomy. They collected their own taxes, administered their own justice, conducted their own raids when opportunity presented itself. The connection to Norway was real, but it was also fragile, dependent on the continued willingness of the jarls to acknowledge a distant king. This pattern, central authority claimed but imperfectly enforced, local rulers operating with substantial independence while maintaining formal subordination, would characterize the Norwegian kingdom for centuries. It was the inevitable result of geography. Norway is not a country that lends itself to centralized control. The mountains and fjords that make it beautiful also make it resistant to unification. Every valley is a potential stronghold. Every stretch of coastline is a potential base for independent action. Harald had overcome these obstacles through extraordinary military and political skill. But the obstacles remained. They would reassert themselves the moment his personal authority weakened. The jarls who served Harald understood their position with clarity. They were powerful men, rulers of substantial territories, commanders of warriors who owed loyalty to them personally. They had submitted to Harald because submission was preferable to destruction, because participation in his system offered benefits that continued resistance could not. But they had not forgotten that their families had once been sovereign, that their ancestors had ruled without acknowledging any overlord, that the tribute they now paid to Harald had once remained in their own hands. Some of them were loyal. Genuine loyalty. Loyalty based on admiration, on shared experience, on something beyond mere calculation, does exist, even among the powerful. Some of Harald's jarls had fought beside him since his youth. They had seen him at Hafrsfjord. They had watched him transform from an ambitious young king into the ruler of all Norway. For these men, loyalty to Harald was personal, rooted in the bonds forged in battle and the years of shared enterprise. But Harald could not live forever. And loyalty to the father does not automatically transfer to the sons. The jarls who were devoted to Harald might feel very differently about Eirik, or about whichever son eventually emerged from the succession struggle. They might see in that struggle an opportunity to expand their own power, to recover lost independence, to position their families for advantage in whatever new order emerged. This was the calculus that operated beneath the surface of Harald's kingdom. On the surface, unity. In the depths, the patient mathematics of ambition and resentment. Harald himself, in his old age, seems to have withdrawn increasingly from active rule. The sources suggest that he delegated more and more authority to his sons, particularly to Eirik, while retaining the formal position of king. This was sensible. A king who can no longer ride to war, who can no longer travel his kingdom to dispense justice and collect tribute personally, must rely on others. But it also meant that the transition of power began before Harald's death, that the sons began to exercise authority while their father still lived, that the habits of succession were established while the old king watched. Whether Harald approved of what he saw is impossible to know. The sagas give us glimpses of an old man, white-haired now, the famous locks that had once marked his oath turned silver with age. They give us a king surrounded by sons and grandsons, by jarls and warriors, by the vast retinue that attended any ruler of his stature. They give us hints of conflict, of dissatisfaction, of the inevitable tensions that arise when power is divided among ambitious men. But they do not give us Harald's inner life. They do not tell us whether he looked at his sons and saw his own legacy secured or his life's work about to be destroyed. Perhaps he did not think in those terms. Perhaps, like most people, he was absorbed in the immediate concerns of each day, the disputes to be settled, the revenues to be collected, the endless small decisions that constitute the work of ruling. Perhaps the future, which seems so clear to us because we know what happened, was opaque to him, hidden behind the illusion of continuity that the present always creates. The wind still blew off the fjords, the ships still sailed, the farmers still worked their land and paid their taxes. The rhythms of life in Harald's Norway would have seemed stable, eternal, immune to change. It takes a particular kind of imagination to look at a functioning system and see its coming dissolution. Most people cannot do it. Most people see the world as it is and assume it will continue. Harald had been an agent of change in his youth. He had looked at a fragmented Norway and imagined a unified one, and then he had made his imagination real through 30 years of warfare and diplomacy. But now he was old, and old men tend to conserve rather than transform. Whatever vision had driven him in his youth had been replaced by the simpler desire to preserve what he had built, to pass it intact to his successors, to die knowing that his work would endure. He could not know that it would not endure. He could not know that within a generation of his death, his kingdom would fragment, that his sons would slaughter each other, that the careful system of subordinate kingships and loyal jarls would collapse into chaos. He could not know that Norway would not be truly unified again until long after everyone who remembered him was dead. But perhaps he suspected. Perhaps in the long evenings of his old age, surrounded by sons who watched each other with the eyes of wolves, Harald Fairhair looked at what he had built and understood its fragility. Perhaps he knew that the unity he had imposed was artificial, that it depended on his personal presence in ways that no institutional arrangement could replace, that the kingdom would die with him even if the name survived. The sources do not tell us. They give us the external facts, the battles, the marriages, the political arrangements, but they do not give us the private man. Harald Fairhair remains, in the end, a figure seen from outside, his motivations inferred rather than known, his inner life a blank that historians fill with their own speculations. What we can say with confidence is this: by the late 9th century, Harald had accomplished something unprecedented in Scandinavian history. He had taken a region divided among dozens of petty kings and jarls and made it, at least nominally, a single kingdom. He had created a political entity called Norway that would persist in some form through all the centuries that followed. He had established the idea that Norway was a thing that could be ruled, a territory that belonged together, a people who shared a common allegiance, and he had set in motion forces he could not control. The emigrants who fled his authority would create new societies in the North Atlantic. The sons who would succeed him would tear his kingdom apart. The jarls who served him would remember their lost independence and teach their sons to remember it too. The farmers who paid his taxes would preserve grievances that would fuel rebellions for generations. The unity Harald achieved was real but temporary. The dispersal his conquests caused was also real and permanent. The Vikings who settled Iceland and the Faroes who established themselves in Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides who raided and traded and eventually settled across the North Atlantic world, these were, in a sense, Harald's creation. Not because he intended to create them, but because his ambition left them no choice but to leave. History works this way more often than we like to admit. The great achievers, the builders of kingdoms and empires, set in motion consequences they cannot foresee. Harald wanted to unite Norway. He succeeded. But in succeeding, he scattered Norwegians across the northern seas, creating communities that would develop their own identities, their own traditions, their own ways of being in the world. The saga of the Vikings is, in part, the story of people running away from Harald Fairhair. And the saga of Norway is in part the story of trying to hold together what Harald had assembled. The old king, white-haired and aging, could see none of this. He saw his kingdom. He saw his sons. He saw the ships in the harbors and the tribute flowing to his treasury. He saw the immediate present, solid and apparently permanent. The future remained hidden, as futures always do. The question of succession haunted him. It had to. Any man who had spent a lifetime consolidating power understood, on some level, that power concentrated in a single person creates a problem that power itself cannot solve. What happens when that person dies? Harald had many sons. The sources disagree on the exact number. Some say 10, some say 20. Some offer even higher figures that strain credulity. The discrepancies reflect the fundamental difficulty of the medieval genealogical record. Sons by different mothers, sons acknowledged and sons disputed, sons who died young and were forgotten, sons who emerged from obscurity to claim a patrimony no one had expected them to claim. What we can say with certainty is that Harald had sons by multiple women, that these sons were raised in different households across Norway, that they were taught to think of themselves as princes with claims to royal authority, and that they learned early to watch each other as rivals. This was not merely a failure of planning on Harald's part. It was the logic of his own system turning against itself. Harald had built his kingdom through marriage alliances, binding powerful families to his cause by taking their daughters as wives or concubines, producing sons who carried the blood of both the royal line and the regional aristocracy. Each son represented a political compromise, a bond between Harald and a local power structure. Each son had maternal kin who had expectations, who had invested in the marriage precisely because they anticipated returns when the boy came into his inheritance. To disinherit any of them was to break the alliance that had produced them. And so, Harald ruled over a kingdom that was also a collection of claims waiting to mature. Every son represented a faction. Every faction represented a region, a family, a network of obligation and expectation. The genius of Harald's consolidation, his ability to absorb rival power structures by marrying into them, had created its own nemesis. The kingdom could not be divided without shattering the unity Harald had fought to create, but it could not be left intact without disinheriting sons whose mothers' families had been promised exactly this inheritance. Harald's solution, such as it was to establish a hierarchy among his sons while he still lived. He designated some as regional kings, subordinate to the high kingship, but holding real authority over specific territories. He favored some openly and kept others at a distance. He tried, as aging rulers always try, to manage the transition by shaping it in advance, by making clear who would inherit what, by building coalitions among his heirs that might survive his death. It did not work. It rarely does. The most prominent among Harald's sons was Eric, later called Bloodaxe. The nickname tells its own story. Eric would become one of the most famous and most reviled figures in the saga tradition, a man whose reputation for violence exceeded even the generous standards of the Viking age. But in the years before Harald's death, he was simply the king's favored son, the one Harald had designated as his primary heir, the one whose mother Ragnhild was said to be the most powerful of Harald's queens. Ragnhild herself represents the kind of figure the sources barely preserve, a Danish princess brought to Norway as part of some dynastic arrangement whose precise terms are lost. She exercised influence over Harald that the sagas acknowledge without explaining. She was, the texts suggest, a woman of strong will and considerable intelligence, and she dedicated that will and intelligence to advancing her son's position. In a world where women's power operated through sons, Ragnhild operated effectively. Eric received his father's favor in ways that his half-brothers did not. But favoritism does not create legitimacy. It creates resentment. And the brothers who watched Eric receive their father's blessing carried that resentment with them like a weapon sharpened for future use. We know the names of some of them. Olaf, called Olaf Digre or Olaf the Stout by some sources. Bjorn, who held territories in the southern reaches. Sigurd, who governed somewhere in the north. There were others, their names preserved inconsistently, their territories disputed, their fates tangled together in a confusion of raid and counter-raid, alliance and betrayal, that the sources do not fully untangle because the sources themselves were written by people who did not fully understand the chaos. What they all understood was that their father was going to die. What they all calculated was their position when that happened. What they all prepared for was war. Harald, in his last years, must have seen this coming. The sagas do not give us his internal state, but they give us his actions, and his actions suggest a man trying desperately to hold together what was already coming apart. He convened assemblies, he extracted oaths, he made public pronouncements about the succession. He tried, through the available mechanisms of early medieval kingship, to bind his sons to an arrangement that would preserve the peace. The mechanisms were not adequate to the task. Medieval kingship, particularly Scandinavian kingship of this period, lacked the institutional infrastructure that later states would develop. There was no clear law of primogeniture. There was no bureaucracy to enforce the king's will after his death. There was no army loyal to the throne rather than to the person who sat on it. There were only personal relationships, oaths sworn to a man, not to an office, and personal relationships dissolved when the person died. Harald Fairhair died around 932, though the exact year is disputed. Some sources place his death earlier, some later. The chronicles were not precise about such matters, and the saga tradition that preserved his memory was more concerned with narrative drama than chronological accuracy. What matters is not the precise date, but the immediate consequence, the arrangement he had built, the careful hierarchy of subordinate kings and regional authorities, the system of tribute and obligation that had made Norway a single kingdom, in fact as well as name. It collapsed. The collapse was not instantaneous. It never is. The structures Harald had built had their own momentum, and the men who operated within those structures had their own reasons to maintain them, at least initially. But the center could not hold. The fundamental problem reasserted itself. Multiple sons, each with a claim, each with supporters, each with the martial culture of the Viking age, telling them that claims were won through blood. Eirik Bloodaxe moved first. This was expected. He had been positioned to move first, groomed by his father and his mother for exactly this moment. He had ships, He had warriors loyal to him personally. He had the prestige of having been acknowledged as Harald's primary heir. And he had a temperament, or perhaps simply a strategic calculation, that led him to solve the problem of rival claimants in the most direct way available. He began killing his brothers. The sources describe this with varying degrees of detail and varying degrees of horror. Some brothers died in battle, the acceptable fate of warriors in a martial society. Some died through treachery, invited to feasts and killed by men who had sworn them friendship. Some simply disappeared from the record, their ends unrecorded, their fates left to inference. The saga tradition would later crystallize Eirik's fratricide into a defining characteristic, making him the blood axe precisely because of the brothers whose blood stained his hands. But in the moment, it may have seemed less monstrous than the sagas suggest. Succession violence was common. Brothers killing brothers for thrones was a pattern that repeated across medieval Europe. Eirik was doing what kings did. The difference was one of scale and of perception. Harald had united Norway by violence, but he had framed his violence as nation-building, as the creation of something larger than himself. Eirik's violence created nothing. It only destroyed. Each brother he killed was a regional power structure disrupted, a network of alliances severed, a set of supporters who would never forgive and never forget. Eirik was not building a kingdom. He was pruning a family tree with an axe, and the tree was bleeding to death. Not all the brothers died. Some fled, and it is here that the diaspora Harald's original conquests had initiated found its second wave, its continuation and intensification. Sons of Harald Fairhair, princes of the blood, men who should have ruled in Norway, instead sailed away from Norway because staying meant death. They went to Orkney, to the Hebrides, to Ireland, to the scattered communities of Scandinavian settlement across the North Atlantic. They went to places where other refugees from Harald's earlier consolidation had already established themselves, and they brought with them the legitimacy of royal blood and the grievances of disinherited heirs. The political geography of the Viking world in the mid-10th century cannot be understood without grasping this dynamic. The settlements in Iceland, in the Scottish Isles, in the coastal regions of Ireland, these were not simply overflow populations seeking new land. They were political communities shaped by flight from Norwegian royal authority, communities whose founding narratives included opposition to the House of Harald Fairhair, communities that defined themselves partly through what they had rejected. And now, into these communities came princes of that very house, men who had every reason to share the settlers' grievances against the ruling faction in Norway, men who brought with them the resources and connections and ambitions of the Norwegian aristocracy in exile. Hakon was one of them. Later called Hakon the Good, he would become one of the most significant figures in Norwegian history. But in the years immediately following Harald's death, he was simply one of the surviving sons, one of the brothers who had escaped Eirik's purge. His story is worth following, not because it deviates from the pattern. Brothers fighting for thrones was the pattern, but because it illuminates how that pattern actually worked, how claims were pursued and alliances built and kingdoms won and lost in the chaos of the post-Harald succession. Hakon had been fostered in England. This requires explanation. Fosterage was a common practice in early medieval aristocratic societies, sending a child to be raised in another household, creating bonds of obligation between families, providing the child with connections and education they could not receive at home. But Hakon's fosterage was unusual in its destination. He was raised at the court of Athelstan, King of England, the most powerful ruler in the British Isles, a king whose own project of unification bore certain similarities to what Harald had attempted in Norway. Athelstan had received Hakon as part of some diplomatic arrangement whose precise terms are lost. Perhaps Harald was seeking alliance with the English king. Perhaps he was simply placing a son somewhere safe, out of reach of the fratricidal competition he must have anticipated. Perhaps Athelstan requested the boy, seeing value in having a Norwegian prince educated in English ways, potentially useful as a client ruler if the opportunity arose. The sources do not tell us. What they tell us is that Hakon grew up in England, learned English, absorbed English Christianity. England had been Christian for centuries by this point, and watched Athelstan's court with the attentive eyes of a prince in exile. When news reached England that Harald was dead and Eirik was killing his brothers, Håkon faced a choice. He could stay in England, safe and comfortable, a permanent exile with a prestigious but ultimately powerless position at a foreign court. Or he could return to Norway and contest for the throne his father had built. He returned. The logic of his decision was partly dynastic and partly practical. He was a son of Harald Fairhair. He had as much right to rule Norway as Eirik did. But beyond the claim of blood, he had something Eirik lacked. He had not made himself hated. Eirik's fratricide had alienated exactly the people a king needed to rule, the jarls and regional chieftains whose support provided the actual infrastructure of governance. They had watched Eirik kill their lord's sons, their nephews, their fostering brothers. They had watched him tear apart the careful fabric of alliances Harald had woven, and they were ready for an alternative. Håkon provided that alternative. He landed in Norway sometime around 934 or 935, and he found supporters almost immediately. The Jarls of Trøndelag, the powerful aristocratic families of the Norwegian heartland, rallied to him. They did so not out of loyalty to the House of Harald, that house had demanded much from them, but out of opposition to Eirik, whose violence threatened their own positions, their own families, their own networks of power. What followed was civil war. The term is perhaps too modern, too clean for the reality. It was a series of raids and counter-raids, shifting alliances and temporary truces, regional armies assembled and disbanded as the seasons and the political calculations shifted. Norway had been unified under Harald, but the unity had been personal, not structural. Now, with Harald dead and his sons fighting, the old divisions reasserted themselves. Regions that had submitted to Harald's authority saw no reason to submit to Eirik's. The kingdom fractured along lines that Harald's conquest had obscured but never erased. Eirik fought. He was not incompetent, whatever the saga tradition's moral condemnation might suggest. He had ships and warriors and the resources of the royal treasury. He had the prestige of having been Harald's designated heir. But he had made too many enemies, and those enemies had found in Håkon a banner around which to rally. By around 935 or 936, Eirik Bloodaxe fled Norway. The exile of a king is a strange thing. Eirik remained a king. He had been made king, he had ruled, and the title clung to him even in flight. But a king without a kingdom is a paradox, a walking contradiction, a man defined by a relationship that no longer exists. Eirik would spend the rest of his life chasing that lost definition. He would find temporary power in Orkney, where Norwegian aristocratic exiles had already established themselves. He would find grander but still temporary power in York, in northern England, where the Scandinavian population accepted him as king of a Norse kingdom within England's borders. He would fight and scheme and ally and betray, pursuing the phantom of the Norwegian throne he had lost. He would die in England at the Battle of Stainmore around 954. The circumstances are murky. There are suggestions of betrayal, of former allies turning against him, of the English king finally deciding that this Norwegian exile had outlived his usefulness. But the details matter less than the pattern. Eirik Bloodaxe, son of Harald Fairhair, the brother killer who had seemed positioned to inherit everything, died a landless exile in a foreign country, his body left on a northern English moor for the crows and the rain. The kingdom he had failed to hold fell to Håkon. Håkon the Good, the English-raised prince, the foster son of Athelstan, ruled Norway for roughly 20 years. His reign would be remembered as a golden age, or at least as a competent interregnum between disasters. He maintained the general shape of Harald's kingdom. Norway remained a single political entity, not a collection of independent petty kingdoms, but he did so through methods different from his father's. Where Harald had unified through conquest, Håkon unified through accommodation. He made peace with the jarls, he respected regional prerogatives, he reduced taxes. He gave the aristocracy what they wanted, which was autonomy and dignity, and the sense that the king ruled with them rather than over them. The price of this accommodation was fragility. Håkon's Norway was stable because Håkon made it stable, through his personal relationships with the men who mattered, through his willingness to compromise, through his presence at assemblies and feasts and councils where the actual work of governance happened. But this was the same kind of stability Harald had achieved, personal, not institutional, and it would prove equally mortal. Håkon had another project, one that revealed both his English education and its limitations. He tried to Christianize Norway. This requires context. Christianity had been spreading through Scandinavia slowly, unevenly, through trade contacts and diplomatic missions and individual conversions that happened for reasons political as often as spiritual. But Scandinavia remained predominantly pagan. The old gods, Odin and Thor and Freyr and the rest, still received sacrifice. The old festivals still structured the year. The old beliefs about death and honor and the nature of the world still shaped how people understood their lives. Håkon had grown up Christian. His foster father Athelstan was devout, and the English court was saturated with Christian practice and Christian assumptions. Håkon had absorbed these assumptions, and when he returned to Norway, he brought with him priests and the intention to convert his kingdom. The intention outran the possibility. The Norwegian aristocracy, who had welcomed Håkon as an alternative to Eirik, had not welcomed him as an instrument of religious transformation. The old religion was entangled with the old power structures in ways that conversion threatened to disrupt. The assemblies that governed Norwegian political life were held at sacred sites. The oaths that bound men together were sworn on sacred rings. The very kingship Håkon claimed had religious dimensions that Christian kingship would need to reimagine. To convert Norway was not simply to change what people believed about the gods, it was to restructure the symbolic foundations of social life. Håkon tried and failed. He built churches, he brought priests, he kept the Christian calendar himself and observed Christian fasts and Christian feasts. But he could not compel his subjects to follow, and when they resisted, he lacked the power, or perhaps the will, to force the issue. The sagas suggest that he eventually compromised, participating in pagan ceremonies, even while maintaining his personal Christianity, a theological impossibility that nonetheless made political sense. He was king of a pagan people. He could be king, or he could be uncompromisingly Christian, but he could not be both. He chose to be king. This choice would echo through Norwegian history. Full Christianization would come, eventually, under kings with more power and more ruthlessness than Håkon possessed. But Håkon's attempt and failure established a pattern. Kings pushing conversion, aristocracies resisting, compromises reached that satisfied no one completely. The religious transformation of Norway was not an event but a process extended over generations, and Håkon's reign was one chapter in that process, not its beginning and certainly not its end. Meanwhile, the sons of Eirik Bloodaxe had not forgotten their father's kingdom. They had grown up in exile, in Orkney and Denmark and the scattered Scandinavian settlements of the British Isles. They had been taught to think of Norway as their inheritance, stolen by their father's enemies. They had been raised on grievance and the promise of return. And as they came of age, they began raiding. The raids were probing attacks at first, testing Håkon's defenses, measuring the strength of his support, looking for weaknesses in the structure he had built. Håkon fought back. He had experience. He had been warring in some form since his return to Norway, and he had loyal jarls willing to bring their forces to his support. The sons of Eirik were beaten back, repeatedly, their attempts to reclaim their father's throne frustrated by a half-brother who proved better at holding power than their father had been at keeping it. But attrition works both ways. Håkon was not young anymore. The years of raiding had cost him men and resources. The compromises that had held his coalition together were beginning to fray. And in approximately 961, at a place called Fitjar in western Norway, Håkon the Good fell. The sources describe a battle, a confrontation with the sons of Eirik that turned against him. They describe Håkon wounded by an arrow, dying on the beach, his men gathering around him as the tide came in. They describe his final words, his acceptance of death, his instructions about his burial. They describe, with the saga tradition's characteristic attention to the memorable moment, a king dying in battle as a king should die. What they do not describe, because it was not visible yet, was what his death meant. Norway was about to enter another period of fragmentation. The sons of Eirik would rule, for a time, but they would rule fractiously, fighting among themselves as their father had fought his brothers, repeating the pattern Harald's multiple sons had established. The kingdom would not truly stabilize until Olaf Tryggvason, and then later Olaf Haraldsson, imposed new unifications through new violence. But that is another story. What matters here, at this pause in the narrative, is the arc that has become visible. Harald Fairhair united Norway through conquest. His unification created exiles who would colonize the North Atlantic. His death created civil war that killed most of his sons and drove the survivors into exile of their own. His grandson Hakon achieved a temporary stability that his death dissolved. The kingdom Harald built kept almost existing, a shape that dissolved and reformed and dissolved again, a unity that was always personal and therefore always mortal. The political entity called Norway persisted through all this chaos. The idea that Norway was a thing that could be ruled, that the western Scandinavian coast constituted a kingdom rather than a collection of territories, survived every succession crisis and civil war. Harald's achievement was not the stability he had hoped for. It was not the dynasty he had tried to establish. It was something more abstract and more enduring. He had created a concept, Norway, a name that meant something, a territory that belonged together in the imagination of those who lived there and those who ruled it. The men who would fight over that concept for the next century were fighting over something Harald had made real. The battles were new. The idea they were fighting for was his. And so, we turn now to what Harald left behind in a different sense. Not the kingdom, not the dynasty, not the bloodlines that would continue to tear each other apart for generations. We turn to the people who left. The exodus had begun during Harald's own lifetime. We have already seen the Icelanders, the chieftains and farmers and petty lords who looked at Harald's new order and decided they would rather face the North Atlantic than submit to it. We have seen Ingolfur Arnarsson standing on his high seat pillars, watching them wash ashore on an island of fire and ice, making the choice that would seed a nation. But Iceland was only the most visible destination, the most thoroughly documented in the sources that survive. The reality was larger, messier, more diffuse. The reality was a diaspora. Consider what Harald's unification actually meant for the men who lost. They were not abstract losers in a political game. They were specific people with specific resources, specific skills, specific ships. A jarl who had ruled his fjord for 20 years, whose father had ruled it before him, whose sons had expected to rule it after. When Harald's army arrived and demanded submission, that man faced a choice with no good options. Submit and become subordinate, a tenant in his own hall, owing service and taxes to a king he had never chosen. Fight and probably die, his sons scattered, his name erased, or leave. Many left. The ships that crossed the North Atlantic to Iceland carried not just settlers, but entire social structures in miniature. A chieftain would bring his household, his slaves, his dependent farmers, his smiths and craftsmen, his livestock and seed grain. He would bring his gods, his burial customs, his legal traditions, his feuds. He would bring, in essence, a piece of Norway that Harald had made impossible to maintain in Norway itself. The Icelandic settlement was not immigration in the modern sense, it was transplantation, whole communities uprooting themselves and reconstituting in new soil. But the ships also went east and south and west to lands that were already occupied. The Scottish islands received Norwegian exiles in waves throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. Orkney and Shetland, already partially Scandinavian, became more so as Harald's unification pushed more settlers north and west. The Hebrides, the Isle of Man, the coasts of Scotland itself, these places had been raided by Vikings for generations, but now they began to be settled in a more permanent way. The distinction matters. A raid extracts wealth and leaves. A settlement plants itself and grows. The men who arrived in Scotland in Harald's wake were not looking for plunder, they were looking for land. They were looking for the autonomy they had lost at home. Ireland received them too. The Norse presence in Dublin dates to the mid-9th century, before Harald's unification, but the settlement intensified and expanded as more exiles arrived seeking places beyond the reach of Norwegian kings. The Irish coast became dotted with Scandinavian trading posts, fortified harbors, hybrid communities where Norse and Gaelic cultures mixed in ways that would produce new identities entirely. The Hiberno-Norse, they would eventually be called, neither fully Scandinavian nor fully Irish, but something born of the contact zone between them. The Faroe Islands, halfway between Norway and Iceland, received their share. Tiny, windswept, barely capable of supporting human life, but they were empty, and empty meant free. A man could raise sheep there, catch seabirds, fish the surrounding waters. He would never be wealthy, but he would not have to kneel to Harald Fairhair. And then there was England. The great heathen army had already demonstrated what organized Scandinavian military force could achieve in the British Isles. The sons and grandsons of those warriors held substantial territory in what would become the Danelaw. But the Norwegian exiles added a new dimension. They came not primarily as conquerors, but as settlers and traders, often mixing with the Danish populations already present, sometimes carving out their own distinct enclaves. The Norse presence in northern England, in places like York and the surrounding countryside, drew continuously from the pool of men whom Harald's unification had displaced. The scale of this movement is difficult to quantify. We have no census data, no immigration records, no ship manifests. We have saga traditions that name specific settlers, archaeological evidence that shows cultural transfer, linguistic traces in place names and loanwords. We have the fact that Iceland, by the end of the settlement period around 930, had a population estimated between 10 and 20,000 people, nearly all of whom had arrived within 60 years, nearly all of whom had come from Norway or from Norwegian communities in the British Isles. We have the Danelaw, a region of England where Scandinavian language and law prevailed for generations. We have Orkney, where jarls ruled as Norwegian vassals until the 15th century. What we do not have and cannot have is a count of the dead. Because the diaspora was not just a movement of exiles, it was also a movement of violence. The ships that crossed the North Atlantic carried settlers. The ships that crossed the North Sea often carried raiders, the same men sometimes on different voyages, farming in summer, raiding in autumn, planting barley and stealing silver in alternating seasons. The victims of these raids were not abstractions. They were monks in coastal monasteries, farmers in undefended villages, traders on unprotected roads. They were killed or enslaved or robbed and left destitute by men whose grievance was with Harald Fairhair, but whose violence fell on Northumbrians and Frisians and Franks who had never heard Harald's name. This is the shadow that falls across the diaspora. The creative energy that settled Iceland and established trade routes and built new societies in new lands. That same energy manifested as destruction when it turned toward populated coastlines. The exiles Harald created were not innocent victims finding refuge. Many of them were warriors, trained to violence, equipped for violence, seeing violence as an honorable way to acquire what they needed. They had lost their Norwegian lands, they would take land elsewhere. If the people already living on that land objected, well, objections could be overcome. The English monastic records of the 9th and 10th centuries are studded with laments. The Vikings appear in these texts as a plague, a punishment from God, a force of nature that destroyed without logic or mercy. The monks who wrote these accounts were not interested in distinguishing one Scandinavian from another, one motivation from another. They saw ships with dragon prows. They saw men with axes. They saw their brothers killed, their treasures stolen, their libraries burned. Whether those men were Danes or Norwegians, raiders by choice or exiles by necessity, made no difference to the dead. We cannot separate Harald's achievement from this cost. The kingdom he built was built by displacing men who took their displacement out on others. The exiles he created victims of their own. The chain of consequence runs outward from the unification of Norway to coastlines Harald never saw, to people whose names were never recorded, to suffering that the sagas do not describe, because the sagas were written by the victors or their descendants. This is not to say that Harald was uniquely responsible for Viking raiding. The raids predated his unification by decades. The Danish presence in England owed nothing to Norwegian politics. The dynamics that produced Viking expansion were multiple and overlapping: population pressure, technological innovation, the weakness of Carolingian defenses, the portability of monastic wealth, the prestige that successful raiding brought within Scandinavian society. Harald did not invent Viking raiding, he did not cause it, but he intensified it. He added to the pressure, he pushed men into ships who might otherwise have stayed home, and some of those men killed people who would not otherwise have died. The sagas do not describe this. The sagas are interested in the exiles as founders, as settlers, as the ancestors of the families who would later commission saga writing. They are interested in the journeys across the Atlantic, the landing at Reykjavik, the establishment of new halls in new lands. They are not interested in the raids on Lindisfarne, the sacking of Iona, the blood on the beaches of Northumbria. They do not see those events as part of the same story, but they are part of the same story. A man named Ketil Flatnose appears in the Icelandic sources as a major figure in the settlement period. He was a Norwegian chieftain who left Norway during Harald's consolidation of power, making his way first to the Hebrides and then dispersing his family across the Norse Atlantic. His daughter Oddr the Deep-Minded is one of the most celebrated settlers in Icelandic tradition, a matriarch who established a major landholding and whose descendants include many of the island's most prominent families. The sources treat Ketil and Oddr as heroic figures, pioneers, founders of dynasties. But Ketil did not acquire his position in the Hebrides by peaceful negotiation. The Hebrides were already inhabited. The people living there, Gauls, Picts, the mixed populations of the Scottish islands, did not voluntarily make room for Norwegian refugees. The settlement that Ketil established was a conquest, small in scale but real in its violence. The slaves that Oddr brought to Iceland included Irish captives, people who had been free before Scandinavian ships arrived on their shores. The dynasty that the sources celebrate was founded on dispossession. This is not a condemnation, or rather, it is a condemnation, but not only a condemnation. The point is not to replace the saga heroism with saga villainy, to turn the founders into monsters. The point is to see the full picture, to understand that the creative and the destructive were inseparable, that the same voyages that carried seed grain and hope also carried violence and loss. The Icelandic Althing, the parliament that would become a model for democratic governance, was established by men whose wealth included human beings they had enslaved. The legal traditions that scholars celebrate were traditions that normalized raiding as an economic activity. The society that preserved the sagas, that maintained literacy through centuries when much of Europe lost it, was a society built on the labor of thralls. Harald did not create this system. It existed before him, but his unification intensified the pressures that drove it outward. The scale of the Icelandic settlement, the density of the Scottish island colonies, the expansion of Norse power in Ireland, all of these were connected to the displacement his conquest caused. The kingdom he built pushed people out. The people who were pushed out pushed others out in turn. The chain of displacement ran from Norwegian fjords to Irish monasteries to Icelandic hillsides to places the sagas never mention because no one who survived them was in a position to tell stories. And there is another dimension to this diaspora, one that the sources barely acknowledge because it contradicts the narrative of warrior honor and noble exile. Many of those who left were not warriors. The settlement of Iceland required farmers, shepherds, fishermen, craftsmen, women who could manage households and raise children in harsh conditions. It required people with practical skills, people who knew how to work iron and weave cloth and preserve food for winter. These people appear in the sources only glancingly, as background figures, as the household members that chieftains brought with them. But they were the majority. They were the ones who actually made the settlements work, who turned raw land into functioning communities, who did the daily labor that heroic sagas have no interest in describing. Many of them were not free. The thrall system was fundamental to Scandinavian society, and the settlements of the diaspora reproduced it faithfully. The ships that crossed the Atlantic carried enslaved people as cargo, some captured in raids, some born into slavery, some fallen into bondage through debt or defeat. These people cleared land, tended animals, built houses, performed the grinding work that freed their owners for warfare and governance, and the kinds of activities that sagas celebrate. Without them, the settlements would not have survived, and then, over generations, they disappeared. The thrall system in Iceland faded during the centuries after settlement. The reasons are debated. Economic inefficiency, the difficulty of maintaining unfreedom in a society without strong central authority, the gradual integration of thrall descendants into the free population. By the time the sagas were written, in the 13th century, slavery had largely ended in Iceland. The sagas look back on it as a feature of the founding period, something the ancestors did that the present had moved beyond. But the people themselves, the thralls who built the society their descendants would inherit, are almost entirely invisible. We do not know their names, their origins, their experiences. We know they existed because the legal codes mention them, because the sagas mention them occasionally as plot devices, because the logic of the economy requires them. But their voices are gone, their stories were not preserved. They are present in the sources only as absences, as negative space around the figures the tradition chose to remember. This is what the diaspora really was, a mass movement of people, some willing and some not, some free and some enslaved, some fleeing Harald's authority and some captured by those who fled. It was not a single story, but thousands of stories, most of them lost, a few of them preserved in forms that distort what actually happened. The Icelandic sources give us the chieftain's perspective. They give us the founders and their descendants, the free men who established the Althing, the families whose genealogies were worth tracing. They do not give us the thralls, the raiders' victims, the dispossessed of every coastline the ships touched. Harald Fairhair, sitting in his hall in western Norway, did not cause all of this. He did not plan the settlement of Iceland, did not direct the raids on Ireland, did not organize the colonization of Orkney. But he created the conditions that made these things happen. His unification was a rock thrown into a pond. The ripples spread outward across the North Atlantic, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the English Channel. Where they reached, they changed what they touched. Some of those changes built new societies. Some of them destroyed old ones. Most did both at once. The year is perhaps 880. Harald is still consolidating his hold on Norway, still fighting the battles that would take another decade to complete. But already the ships are leaving. Already the settlements are being founded. Already the raiding parties are landing on foreign beaches, carrying away silver and slaves and stories that would never be written down. The future is taking shape in real time, in the choices of thousands of people responding to pressures Harald created, building consequences he could not foresee. He had wanted a kingdom. He was getting a world. And the world was larger than any saga could contain. The world included Reykjavik and Dublin and York and the Faroe Islands and the unnamed beaches where unnamed people died. It included the children born to Norwegian fathers and Irish mothers, the new languages taking shape in trading ports, the religious syncretisms that mixed Thor and Christ in ways that horrified purists on both sides. It included the sea routes that would eventually lead to Greenland, and beyond Greenland to a continent that no European knew existed, where Leif Erikson would stand on a beach 5 generations later and wonder what his ancestors had stumbled into. All of this was implicit in Harald's choice to unify Norway by force. All of this was contained in the exiles his conquest produced. The kingdom he built was smaller than the diaspora it created. The Norway that obeyed him was a fraction of the Scandinavian world that his reign reshaped. The stones remain in places. The foundations of longhouses in Iceland, the ruins of Norse settlements in the Hebrides, the archaeological traces of a people on the move. The land remembers in its way, though it does not remember as humans remember. It holds the evidence without holding the meaning. A burned beam in a Scottish island, a buried coin in an English field, a name on a runestone that no one living can pronounce correctly. The people who made these marks are gone. Their stories are gone. What remains is the shape of their passage, the evidence that they were here, that they moved through these places and left traces that outlasted their names. Harald's kingdom is one of those traces. The diaspora is another. Both are real. Both are incomplete. Both are what history leaves behind when the living have finished their work and the dead have begun their long silence. The silence, when it came slowly. Harald Fairhair did not die in battle. He did not fall to an assassin's blade or drown in the cold waters he had spent his life mastering. He died the way most successful conquerors die if they are lucky enough to grow old, in bed, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, watching the kingdom he had built begin to fracture before his eyes were closed. The sources disagree on the year. They disagree on almost everything. Some say 930, some say 932, some say later still. The precision that modern historians crave was not a gift the saga writers chose to give. What they gave instead was a portrait of decline, a king grown old in a realm grown restless, a man who had spent his youth in motion, now confined to the stillness that age imposes on even the strongest bodies. He had ruled for perhaps 60 years, perhaps longer. The numbers are uncertain because the beginning was uncertain, because no one thought to mark the moment when a boy in a petty kingdom decided he would have all of Norway or die trying. By the time the chroniclers cared enough to count, too many witnesses were dead, too many memories had blurred into legend, too many competing claims had muddied what should have been a simple calculation. What matters is the shape of the reign, not its exact dimensions. What matters is that Harald lived long enough to see his work begin to unravel. He had sons. He had many sons. The sources cannot agree on how many. Some say 9, some say 16, some say 20. The number grew in the telling, as numbers do when they serve political purposes. Every family that wanted to claim descent from the first king had reason to add another son to the list, another branch to the tree, another link in the chain that connected present power to past glory. But even the most conservative count gives Harald more heirs than any kingdom could absorb. This was the problem he had created for himself, the flaw built into the foundation of everything he had achieved. He had unified Norway by conquest. He had held it together by force of personality and the loyalty of men who had fought beside him. But he had not solved the problem that would outlast him, the problem of succession in a world that did not yet believe in primogeniture, that did not yet accept that the eldest son had an automatic claim superior to his brothers. In the Norway Harald had conquered, in the Scandinavia he had grown up in, kingship was not inherited. It was taken. It was proven. A king was a king because he could hold what he claimed, because men would follow him, because he had demonstrated the qualities that made other men willing to die on his behalf. Harald had demonstrated those qualities. His sons had not. They had grown up in his shadow, in a kingdom already made, in a world where the hard work of conquest had been done before they were old enough to participate. Some of them were capable, some of them were weak. Some of them were violent in ways that served no purpose, cruel without strategy, ambitious without patience. The sources give us names and fragments: Eric Bloodaxe, whose epithet tells us something about his methods; Hakon, raised in the Christian court of the English king Athelstan, who would return to Norway with foreign ideas and foreign backing; others whose stories have been lost or compressed into footnotes; brothers who died young or submitted or fled, who became the raw material of civil wars their father had spent his life preventing. Harald, in his final years, seems to have recognized what was coming. He attempted to manage the succession, to distribute power among his sons in ways that might prevent open conflict. He gave them territories, carved his unified kingdom back into pieces, assigned each son a region to rule under his nominal authority. It was a compromise between the centralization he had fought for and the fragmentation that Scandinavian political culture still expected. It was also, with hindsight, a formula for disaster. A kingdom divided among brothers is a kingdom waiting for war. Each son had a territory. Each territory had resources. Each brother had ambition and resentment and the memory of slights real or imagined. The alliances Harald had built, the loyalties he had commanded, were personal. They did not transfer automatically to his heirs. The jarls and chieftains who had followed him would have to choose whom to follow next, and their choices would not be unanimous. The old king watched this unfold. He watched his sons position themselves, watched the alliances shift, watched the careful architecture of his reign begin to show cracks that would become fractures, that would become collapse. He had built a kingdom, but he had not built a system. He had created a state that depended on his presence, and he was no longer able to be present in the ways the kingdom required. The hair, they said, had gone white. The fair hair that had given him his name, that had been his banner and his identity, had faded with the decades. The man who had once seemed golden now seemed merely old. The body that had swung swords in 100 battles now struggled with the simple work of living. The voice that had commanded armies now commanded only servants and the sons who were already looking past him to the future they would fight over. He died. The sources do not give us a death scene worthy of the life. They do not give us final words or dramatic gestures or the kind of narrative closure that sagas usually provide. They give us instead the simple fact. Harald Fairhair died, and Norway immediately began to tear itself apart. Eric Bloodaxe seized the throne, or claimed to seize it. The distinction matters because the claim was contested from the beginning. His brothers did not accept his supremacy. The jarls did not unanimously support him. The kingdom that Harald had spent 60 years building took less than 2 years to fragment into competing factions, rival claimants, the chaos of succession that haunted every medieval monarchy but haunted Scandinavian monarchies most of all. Eric ruled briefly and brutally. He killed brothers. How many depends on which source you trust, but multiple brothers, enough that his nickname seems earned. He made enemies faster than he made allies. He generated the kind of opposition that his father had always been able to absorb or defeat, but that Eric lacked the political skill to manage. Within a few years, he was driven out of Norway entirely, an exile in the kingdom his father had built, a wanderer in the North Atlantic world his father's conquests had created. He ended up in York, of all places. The Viking kingdom of Northumbria, that strange hybrid state where Scandinavian warlords ruled over English subjects, where the descendants of the great heathen army had built something that was neither quite English nor quite Norse. Eric became king there, the son of Norway's first king ruling a fragment of England that his father had never seen. The irony would have been lost on him, but it should not be lost on us. The diaspora that Harald's unification had created now absorbed Harald's own son. The exile that had built Iceland and colonized the Scottish Islands now claimed a prince of the very kingdom that had produced the exiles. Eric died in England, ambushed at a place called Stainmore, killed by the kind of treachery that was endemic to the politics of the age. His body was left on English soil, far from the Norway he had briefly ruled, far from the father whose legacy he had been unable to maintain. The line did not end with him. There were other sons, other claimants, other branches of the family tree that would continue to fight over Norway for generations. But something ended at Stainmore. Some possibility closed. The direct transmission of Harald's achievement to Harald's chosen successor had failed. Back in Norway, the kingdom continued to fracture and reform, a century of instability that was Harald's true legacy as much as the unification itself. His grandsons fought. His great-grandsons fought. The petty kingdoms he had conquered reasserted themselves in new forms, under new names, led by men who claimed descent from the royal line Harald had established. The unification he had achieved was real, but it was not permanent. It was a moment in a longer process, a first attempt that would require many subsequent attempts before Norway became the stable kingdom that exists today. And yet the achievement was real. The idea was planted. The precedent was set. After Harald, everyone who wanted to rule Norway had to contend with the memory of what he had done. The kingdom could fragment, but it could not unfragment into the dozens of petty territories that had existed before him. The political imagination had been changed. Men who would once have been content with a single fjord now dreamed of the whole coastline. Men who would once have accepted the limits of their father's ambitions now reached for the scope of Harald's. This is what founders do. They do not build things that last unchanged. They build things that change what comes after. They establish patterns that persist, even when the specific structures they created have crumbled. Harald's Norway lasted in its original form perhaps a decade after his death. Harald's idea of Norway lasted 1,000 years and continues to shape the country that bears the name today. The diaspora, meanwhile, continued. The settlements in Iceland grew and stabilized. The Althing met each summer, governing without a king, as if in deliberate rejection of everything Harald had represented. The Icelandic Commonwealth would last for over 300 years, longer than most kingdoms, a society of free farmers who had chosen to be governed by law rather than by the sword. They told stories about Harald. They preserved his memory in the sagas they wrote, centuries later, looking back at the king whose ambition had driven their ancestors across the sea. They were not grateful, exactly. Gratitude was not the emotion they felt toward the man who had forced their grandfathers into exile. But they acknowledged him. They understood that their freedom was, in some twisted way, a consequence of his tyranny. In the Orkneys and Shetlands, the Norse settlements became permanent. Jarls ruled there for centuries, technically subject to the Norwegian crown, practically independent, a scattered archipelago of Scandinavian culture planted in the North Atlantic. The language shifted. The customs blended. The people became something new, neither quite Norwegian nor quite Scottish, a hybrid population that would eventually be absorbed into the Kingdom of Scotland, but would retain traces of its Norse origins in place names and legal traditions in the shape of certain faces. In the Faroe Islands, the same pattern repeated. In the Hebrides, in Man. In Dublin, where Norse kings ruled an Irish city and produced a culture that mixed Celtic and Scandinavian elements in ways that neither pure tradition would have recognized. The ripples continued to spread generations after Harald's death in places he had never seen, among people who had never heard his name except as a distant legend, the king who had started everything, the reason their great-great-grandfathers had gotten on boats. The most distant ripple reached North America. We have traced this already. Leif Erikson, 5 generations removed, standing on a beach in a continent that had no name in any European language. But it bears repeating here, at the end of Harald's story, because it completes the scope of what his ambition accidentally accomplished. A man who wanted to rule a single country produced a diaspora that touched 4 continents. A man who cared nothing for exploration created the conditions that made exploration inevitable. A man who probably never sailed more than a few hundred miles from his birthplace set in motion a chain of events that would not reach its final link for 100 years after his death, in a place so distant that the very concept of distance would have been meaningless to him. He could not have known. This is the phrase that keeps returning, the phrase that captures something essential about how history actually works. Harald Fairhair could not have known what he was doing. He knew he was building a kingdom. He knew he was fighting wars. He knew he was forcing men into exile, and that some of those men hated him for it. He did not know he was launching a demographic transformation that would reshape the North Atlantic. He did not know he was planting the seeds of Iceland, of the Orkneys, of the Norse presence in Britain that would culminate in 1066. He did not know that his ambition to rule one country would create the conditions for Scandinavians to influence a dozen. This is the gap between intention and consequence that defines so much of human history. We act for our own reasons, pursuing our own goals, operating within our own horizons. The effects of our actions radiate outward, beyond our sight, beyond our lifetimes, beyond our imagination. Harald wanted Gaida. Harald wanted Norway. Harald wanted to be called king. He got all of these things. He also got a world, spinning outward from his choices, continuing to spin after his death, continuing to spin now, 1,000 years later, in the political boundaries and cultural memories and genetic inheritances that trace back, however distantly, to the ships that left his shores. The hair turned white. The body failed. The kingdom fractured. The man who had been Harald Fairhair became Harald the Old, Harald the Fading, Harald the Gone. His bones were buried somewhere. The sources disagree on where, disagree on how, disagree on the ceremonies that attended his passage from the world of the living to whatever world awaited. The physical evidence of his existence has not survived. No grave has been found that can be definitively attributed to him. No artifact has been unearthed that can be proven to have been his. He left no words in his own voice, no runic inscription, no object bearing his mark. He is known only through the words of others, written centuries after his death, shaped by agendas he could not have anticipated. And yet, he was real. He stood in places that still exist. He looked at fjords that still reflect the same gray sky. He felt the same wind that still blows across the Norwegian coast, the same cold that still settles in the same valleys, the same salt air that still rises from the same waters. The land does not remember him, but the land was there. The stones do not preserve his image, but the stones were present when he passed. Something of the world he inhabited still exists, available to anyone willing to travel, to stand where he might have stood, to feel what he might have felt, to imagine backward across the centuries toward a man who cannot be fully known but who cannot be entirely lost. Norway remembers. The country that exists today, the constitutional monarchy with its oil wealth and its social democracy and its place among the nations of the modern world, traces its origin to Harald Fairhair. The connection is not simple. Centuries intervened between his death and the emergence of the Norway that exists now. Other kings ruled, other dynasties rose and fell, other transformations reshaped the society he had known beyond recognition. But the beginning is still the beginning. The first is still the first. When Norwegians tell the story of their country, they begin with the man who first imagined it as a single thing. Iceland remembers differently. The sagas that preserve Harald's story were written there by the descendants of the people he had exiled. They remembered him as the cause of their displacement, the reason their ancestors had crossed the sea, the king whose tyranny had produced their freedom. It is a complicated memory, neither wholly negative nor wholly positive, a recognition that sometimes good things come from bad causes, that the refugee's journey can lead to a better place than the homeland left behind. The settlements in Scotland and Ireland and England do not remember at all, or remember only in fragments, in place names and archaeological traces, and the occasional genetic study that reveals unexpected Norse ancestry in populations that thought themselves purely Celtic or purely Anglo-Saxon. The memory fades at the edges, diffuses into the general background of European history, becomes part of patterns too large to attribute to any single person. But patterns have origins. Diffusions have sources. The thing that spread outward across the North Atlantic in the 9th and 10th centuries was not inevitable. It was not determined by geography or climate or some abstract force of historical necessity. It was produced by choices, by actions, by the decisions of specific people pursuing specific goals. Harald Fairhair was one of those people. He was not the only one, and he was not the most important one for most of the places his diaspora reached, but he was the beginning. He was the rock thrown into the water. The ripples have not stopped. They continue in the languages spoken across Northern Europe, which carry Norse loanwords embedded in their vocabularies. They continue in the legal traditions that trace back to the Althing, in the parliamentary systems that owe something to the assemblies of free men that governed the Norse settlements. They continue in the names of places, any English village ending in by or thorpe, any Scottish island with a Norse name, any Irish city that was once a Viking trading post. The modern world contains Harald's legacy, distributed so widely that it is no longer recognizable as his, absorbed into the background of things we take for granted. The wind still blows across the Hardanger Fjord. The mountains still rise, gray and patient, above the waters where his ships once sailed. The stone remains where it was placed, even if we cannot be sure which stones he touched, which cliffs he saw, which beaches felt his footsteps. The land endures. The sea endures. The sky endures. The same slow cycling of light and dark that measured his days as it measures ours. He is not here. He has not been here for 11 centuries. The man who once controlled this coastline, who commanded the loyalty of thousands, who changed the shape of European history, has been reduced to words on pages, to the residue of memory, to the interpretations of scholars who will never meet him. The gap between who he was and what we can know about him is not closable. It will never be closed. We tell the story because the story matters, because the patterns he set in motion still affect us, because understanding where we came from is part of understanding who we are. But we tell the story knowing that the story is incomplete, that the man exceeds the narrative, that something essential has been lost in the transmission across 1,000 years. The first king of Norway, the unifier, the conqueror. The man who wanted one woman and took a country to win her, or so the story goes. The man whose ambition emptied ships into the Atlantic, filled islands with refugees, planted settlements that grew into nations. The man who could not have known what he was doing, and who did it anyway, and who changed everything because changing everything was the price of changing anything. A boy in Vestfold, watching the horizon, imagining what lay beyond it. A king in his hall, watching his sons, imagining what would come after. A name in a saga, watching from the silence of the past, still waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The sea keeps no record of the ships that crossed it. The wind leaves no trace of the sails it filled. The land holds its secrets, gives them up slowly, sometimes never. What remains is what remains, the shape of a story, the echo of an ambition, the long consequences of a single human life. Harald Fairhair built a kingdom. The kingdom fell. The idea endured. The ships sailed west. Some found land, some found nothing. 1,000 years passed. The world his choices made is still here, still changing, still carrying his legacy forward into futures he could not imagine, toward ends he would not recognize. The waves still break on the shores he knew. The stones still wait for someone to read them. The story is not finished. It never is.